Hey everybody on YouTube, it's me, Rachel, the student witch, and I'm here today to start a new series. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and it is a series about fertility awareness and the fertility awareness method, which is something that I have been practicing / charting for about 2 cycles now. I'm on my 2nd cycle, and it has just opened so many doors into my shadow. It's opened so many doors to empowerment for me. It's just been revolutionary, and I just want to kind of share my experience with you guys and kind of use these videos as a way to track how I've progressed and how I feel and how I've grown while using this method. So before I go into the details of my fertility awareness history, I just wanted to kind of set up a few housekeeping rules. Number 1, I am framing this series as I try to frame my channel in general under the guidelines of reproductive justice. Now, reproductive justice, it's intersectional with all sorts of different aspects of justice, sexuality justice, gender expression justice, race justice, socioeconomic class justice. All these different aspects of justice are intersectional. So when we talk about reproductive justice, we have to keep in mind race, class, gender expression, sexuality, majority versus minority. We have to keep all those things in mind. Housekeeping number 2, I'm not going to be making any explicit how-to videos for this series, and that the reasoning behind that is kind of twofold. For one thing, I'm very new to the fertility awareness method as a method of being aware of your overall health, but also as a method to either achieve or avoid pregnancy. I have just been charting, as of now, I've only been charting 2 cycles, so it would be kind of ridiculous for me to present myself as the teacher of a method that I'm still learning myself. But also, I think it's really important for anyone interested in this method, interested in learning more or interested in getting off of hormonal birth control, anyone interested in possibly practicing this method or just learning more about their bodies, it's important for them to read. You cannot perfect or learn enough about this method simply by watching a couple of YouTube videos. You need to go out there and do your research. And the book that I started with is Katie Singer's The Garden of Fertility, a guide to charting your fertility signals to prevent or achieve pregnancy naturally and to gauge your reproductive health. Okay, so housekeeping put aside, let me just tell you the long and rambling story in a short and succinct way, if that's possible, of how I came across this method. So I grew up in rural Kentucky, right? I was not born in Kentucky, but I have family roots in Appalachia, and I grew up in a small town that's in the western part of the state, kind of in between Louisville and Lexington. And at the time, this town was in a dry county, and it was very conservative. It still is to this day. That's the refrigerator, by the way, making noise. And so my sex health education was basically non-existent. My parents didn't teach me anything. The only thing my mom taught me was how to use a tampon, and the only thing my dad taught me and my sister, before my sister went off to college, was that condoms and the morning after pill were options that we should always consider. That was it. There's no explanation about fertility, no explanation about sexuality, nothing. So in high school, I think my sophomore or junior year, we were required to take a health/PE class. So the fall semester was a health class, spring semester was a PE class, And the high school football coach taught the class, meaning he sat at his desk for the entire class period taking notes about football drills or whatever, and he just told us to read chapters in the book and answer the questions at the end of the chapter in order to get our points for that day. Then, when it came time for the sexual health chapter, my public high school had a Christian group from one of the local churches come in to teach us abstinence-only sex ed. It was heteronormative, of course. There was no mention of any sort of queer or gay, bisexuality, none of that. There was no mention of pleasure and the importance of sexual pleasure for mental and emotional health and even physical health. There was no mention of how to tell if or when you're fertile. There's barely any mention of condoms, besides we were told that they're not effective. And the only thing that was drilled into our heads were condoms don't work, save yourself for Jesus, make a public promise that you will save yourself for marriage. And then they showed us pictures. They separated the guys from the girls, and we went into the room and they showed us projected slides of horrific cases of STDs to scare us into not having sex. So 0 useful information, a shit ton of religious dogma and homophobia and even slut shaming. That was my sex ed in high school. And again, this was a religious Christian group coming in to a public school funded by public tax dollars to indoctrinate kids into being afraid of sex, totally ignorant about any practical information, and just, it was bad. It was just very bad. So I went off to college, I became a feminist, I liberated myself through knowledge and learning, which I continue to do. I minored in women's and gender studies in college. I left Christianity, and I liberated myself sexually and explored myself and my own sexuality. So my senior year of college is when I started taking hormonal birth control. I think I started taking the generic brand version of Yaz or Yasmin. That was kind of like a popular birth control. I don't know if it still is, but it was popular about 7 or 8 years ago. So I took that for around a year or a year and a half. And then I stopped taking it because I was single and my prescription ran out and I just stopped taking it. Then the fall of 2011, late fall 2011, around November, I started taking hormonal birth control again in the form of a pill, but this time it was the pill that just contained synthetic progesterone. So the first pill I took had both the synthetic estrogen and progesterone. This time I was just taking the synthetic progesterone because when I went to the health center, they asked me if I had ocular migraines from time to time. And ocular migraines are a specific type of migraine that affect your vision. People can even see spots, and for me, like, half of my vision will get really fuzzy and I see spots and I can't even read words on a page if I tried. So I have ocular migraines, and apparently people who have ocular migraines, if they take hormonal birth control that contains estrogen or synthetic estrogen, that puts them even more at risk for stroke. Everyone who takes synthetic estrogen in the form of birth control is at risk for stroke, but if you have ocular migraines, you're even more at risk. So they wouldn't prescribe to me the birth control that has both estrogen and progesterone. They just gave me the progesterone kind. And I was fucking miserable for about 7 or 8 months. I was only taking it because I was casually sleeping with a guy that I met. He turned out to be an asshole. I broke up with him, and then I eventually met and started dating the guy who would become my husband. When I started dating my husband, I was just miserable for months and months. It made me skip my period, and I have very regular periods. Every 27 to 29 days I have my period. It's been like that since I can remember. And so I skipped my period, and I was freaking out that I was pregnant. I wasn't, of course. I just felt like backed up. I felt bloated all the time. Excuse me. My emotions were just a wild up and down roller coaster, and my breasts were so swollen and sensitive that even when I took a shower, the water from the shower head would hurt them. It would be painful to take a shower. So eventually I went in to complain about these symptoms, especially the emotional symptoms or negative effects that I was feeling on the birth control. And the stupid nurse practitioner kind of apathetically looked at me and just said, well, you can just take an antidepressant to counteract the birth control. And that's just when like a switch went off in my mind, like, holy shit, like, I don't need to be taking this, and Lord knows what this might be doing to my body. And now a caveat here. I am not anti-birth control simply because I can critique it and what it has done to me personally. I'm just recording here my personal experience and talking about my personal experience. I am very well aware that millions of people have to take birth control because they have genetic issues, hormonal issues, polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, all sorts of things, and that for these people, birth control has been liberating and empowering. All right, I'm very aware of that. But for me personally, it made me miserable. I also, around that same time, got the first UTI I had ever gotten. Well, not the first, but it was the first one I had gotten since I was in college. So the second UTI I had ever gotten. And it's only in hindsight that I realized that the hormonal birth control I was taking for that 7 to 8 month period probably had something to do with it. Because after that 7 to 8 month period, and during it, when I got this UTI, I kept getting UTIs practically 3 or 4 times a year for about a 1.5 to 2 year time frame. It was horrendous. It was terrible. And now looking back on it, I think the hormonal birth control I was on had something to do with it. So I was feeling miserable. I had all these negative symptoms. On top of that, it was affecting my immune system, and I kept getting these UTIs. And finally, after months and months of my husband, or the guy I was dating who would become my husband, pleading with me to just stop taking it, I finally listened to him, and I just quit taking it. And my skin cleared up. I didn't have this painful sensitivity in my breasts all the time. I didn't feel like I was bloated all the time. My emotions balanced back out. And my husband and I have just been using condoms for the 5.5 years total that we've been together. So yes, so 5.5 years of using condoms, and now for the past 1.5 years or so, I've been dealing with this recurrent yeast infection issue. It started January 2016. Yeah, January 2016, I got a yeast infection out of the blue. Not normal for me. I think before then I had only had maybe 1 or 2 yeast infections in my entire life. And so I just treated it with the over-the-counter stuff. And it just never went away. And so for about about 6 to 9 months, I basically had a yeast infection constantly. The only time I did not feel discomfort and when I did not have yeast discharge was when I was on my period. So constant yeast infection. And I tried everything. I changed my diet. I used boric acid, which did help, but it came back. I used all sorts of over-the-counter stuff. I used all sorts of hippy-dippy over-the-counter suppositories and pills and things. I used prescription strength, like different types of antifungal prescription strength stuff. I was even prescribed the antifungal pill, what's it called, fluconazole, I think. I was prescribed that. I was told to take it 3 times in 1 week and then once a week, every week after that. And at first it worked, but then I realized antifungal medication can be pretty intense on your system, especially your liver. And so I realized I was just treating the symptom, I wasn't treating the cause. And I didn't want to take an antifungal pill for the rest of my life without possibly knowing that what's causing this might be a thyroid issue or an estrogen dominance issue or something else that I wasn't aware of. I cannot put into words how frustrated I got with all the different doctors I talked to. I talked to, doctors and nurse practitioners just in my university health center, and I even was referred to the lead researcher and doctor in the gynecology department. Like this gynecologist, she specifically researched yeast in Massachusetts General Hospital, which is one of the best hospitals around, and her solution was just for me to keep taking this pill every week. And I had another breaking point. I personally am not comfortable with just treating the symptom without understanding the cause. And I felt like the doctors just weren't listening to me. They would come into the little room for about 15 minutes, hear my story, which I had to practice and get the speech down to make sure it fit within 5 minutes, Oftentimes I'd be in tears and they would just say, take this pill, So I just can't just take a pill. I also have some ethical issues about how pharmaceutical companies conduct themselves and how they fund research and where the money goes to research. It often goes to treating symptoms versus causes, because if you look at it from their capitalist perspective, it's much more lucrative for them to have patients depend on taking pills versus treating the cause to where the patient doesn't need to take a medication anymore. So yeah, I just have issues with that. So just through diet and meditation and shadow work, actually, I've gotten the yeast infections more under control. This time last year, I was basically experiencing yeast and yeast discharge and symptoms throughout my cycle. Now I've gotten it down to where I only experience it 1 or 2 days out of my entire cycle, and that is the day, 1 or 2 days, when I ovulate, when I'm most fertile. So I've managed all of this on my own, and I was researching what can I do to learn more about my body, and that's when I came across this book. And that's when I first heard of the phrase or the term fertility awareness, and I learned that there was a fertility awareness method. And now I had the preconception that these methods don't work, that you have to take a pill or there has to be a barrier. So many women think that they can do this and they end up accidentally getting pregnant. It's just the rhythm method, and everyone knows the rhythm method doesn't work. I was conflating fertility awareness with the rhythm method, which is wrong. The rhythm method does not work because you don't constantly collect data and gauge your fertility based on evidence. The rhythm method is outdated and no one should use it anymore. I hope no one uses it anymore, because basically you guesstimate when you're fertile and then you predict future months based on that. So I know I ovulated on day 15 of my last cycle, so I'm just going to guesstimate that I'm probably fertile around that time during this cycle kind of thing, which is just a recipe for disaster. Fertility awareness is you're constantly collecting data on yourself and on your cycle. You're constantly taking your basal body temperature, and you can tell from your temperature when you ovulate. Or you can also tell from your temperature if you might have a thyroid issue or a progesterone deficiency. So many things you can tell just from your temperature. You also collect data on your cervical mucus. You can also collect data on the height and texture of your cervix. Like, you're constantly every day taking just a couple minutes each day to gather this information. Take your temperature in the morning before you get out of bed at the same time every morning. Check your cervical fluid throughout the day and check your cervix height, and using that information to exactly know when you're fertile, when you might need to use a barrier method if you are sexually active but you're not ready to have kids, or when exactly you're fertile and when you and your partner should be trying to have kids or having the artificial insemination or whatever. This method is so good. It's so liberating, and specifically the Garden of Fertility book, it is queer friendly because it doesn't talk about fertility within a heteronormative framework like natural family planning does. Natural family planning is what is taught and practiced by Catholics within the Catholic Church and Catholic dogma, and the Catholic Church and Catholic dogma as a religious, political, and financial institution is very heteronormative, very patriarchal, very sexist. So fertility awareness is not that. It's just being aware of your fertility. It's not a mandate to have to get married in a heteronormative way. It's not a mandate to be monogamous. It's not a mandate to have kids. This isn't based on a religious institution or ideology. This is based on science, but also the wisdom of women's experiences. Or not women's, but people with uteruses, people who menstruate, our experiences and our wisdom. And that is one of the reasons why I feel so empowered by this method, but also why I feel comfortable using this method, because it's not heteronormative and because it's empowering, because it's accessible. You don't need health insurance to practice this as a form of birth control, or as a way to achieve pregnancy. You empower yourself, and you don't need to buy a pill. You don't need to pay a copay. You don't even need a prescription from a doctor. The one thing you do need, though, is to educate yourself. And if that means reading all the books that you can, great. If that means that you can find someone in your local area who teaches fertility awareness, even better. It's been so liberating and empowering. I feel like just in the past 2 cycles since I've been charting, I've learned more about my body and my cycle and my health than I have in the past 20, almost 30 years that I've been on this planet. So I'm super excited about this series. I'm sorry that this first video is kind of long, but I just had to go into the history of the series of decisions and incidents that led me to this point. I'm super excited to get to know the method more and to actually use it as a form of preventing pregnancy. My husband and I, we're not comfortable depending solely on this method. We are still using condoms, but I would like to eventually get to where we just use condoms when we know for sure I'm fertile. And then eventually we'll see where things go, and I'll talk about it here. I'll talk about it openly here. So this is an open space for everyone to learn and share their experiences about the fertility awareness method. This will be a playlist on my channel. I have a whole host of other videos that I want to talk about within this playlist and under this topic, and I'm super duper excited. So, yes, I'm so excited. Empowerment. Okay, until next time, many blessings and keep on charting. Bye.